Welcome to the Leap Health Workplace podcast. Here we explore innovative, proven health and wellbeing solutions to drive your performance and productivity. Leap Health empowers individuals and organisations to prioritise their health and wellbeing as a catalyst to performance and productivity. We do this by providing workplace health and wellbeing performance workshops and also the Leap 360 one-to-one leadership coaching to drive health, wellbeing and performance, powered by the Game Changer Index Energy for Impact profiling tool. And we offer bespoke corporate programs to ignite proactivity in ownership at all levels of health and wellbeing as a catalyst to performance and productivity. Whether you're sat at your desk right now or on the move, get ready to listen, get ready to invest your time and take action straight after. I'm Anna Reddy. Let's get ready to make small steps to leap health. Welcome to today's episode, and today we're exploring ADHD in the workplace, but with a little bit of a difference about how you can really embrace being your whole self. And we're going to tie it into what are some of the topical key trends right now in the workplace. So you will have heard recently on the podcast around some of the key trends in the workplace. And today, hopefully, you're going to get a greater insight as to how we can embrace everyone's mind and how it works differently, so that we can be operating at an even greater level. So I'm delighted to welcome two guests today. You've got two for the price of one today. We've got Andy Cracknell, who's going to be talking about his experience after recently being diagnosed with ADHD. And he's not unfamiliar to the podcast because he did do a wonderful episode for us back in March 23. Again, this was all around his whole self, and he shared a very, very emotional, brave journey, which delves into lots of different areas of life which people can learn a lot from. So I really would encourage you to go back to that episode, and I will put a link in the show notes as well. And we're also delighted to welcome Dr. John Mervyn-Smith, who is the co-founder of the Game Changer Index, psychologist, and lots of years experience in terms of working with different kinds of minds and how we can get the best out of everyone. So I'm not going to steal the thunder and introduce them in more depth. I'm going to leave it to you guys. So over to you two, and please just introduce yourselves again. Tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you think you're going to bring to the podcast today.
Okay, so as Anna said, I'm Andy Cracknell. I am 500 mile an hour, 200 ideas a second, high energy, incredibly creative. And recently, as Anna said, diagnosed with ADHD, and it's kind of reframed the way I see myself and how I show up.
And Andy, we've known each other probably close to a decade. So hi everyone. So my background is psychology, as Anna was saying. I trained and worked as a clinical psychologist in the NHS. But psychology is all about understanding individual differences. That is my world. This theme of neurodiversity and ADHD within it is a way of understanding how people are different and how people are similar. And about 4 years ago, I started to take a much closer interest in this particular difference. I'll tell you the quick story on this, and then we'll see how that relates to my understanding of Andy. But I had a conversation with an engineer in a company that you all know, but I can't name. And he was widely regarded by his colleagues as a genius, but a pain in the backside at the same time. And I found him fascinating to talk to. And then he declared at one point that he had ADHD, and I suddenly realized that people with ADHD do think differently. And it was an observation that I held on to for some years until last year we put this to the test with the GC index. I wanted to know, could we understand this difference in a positive way through the lens of this thing called the GC index that looks at individual differences for the ways in which people focus their energy? And a picture emerged, and we'll talk about that, Andy, I think, and see how it relates to your world. Is that a starter for us, Anna, in terms of an intro?
Well, that's certainly made us curious about what this data revealed, doesn't it? But we're going to hold it there. There's a bit more to delve into before we start to reveal this. So let's just get a bit of the science. I'm going to pick your brains now as a psychologist in terms of the science. First question, though, is, some people say it's genetic, some people say it's environmental, some people just say it's a trend. So, we have the likes of Gabor Mate that talks a lot about how it's your upbringing and how that changes your brain. Other people I only heard recently that, it's as genetic as your height. What is it? Is it genetic or is it environmental? And then to go a little bit deeper as well, in terms of the differences in our brain, as far as I'm aware, there's not much difference in terms of the structure, but it's the neurochemicals within our brain that show slight differences. So, John, I'd love your insights into this, please.
Well, it takes me back. I don't want to bore you with the stories, but it takes me back to my undergraduate days of asking the question about a whole range of conditions as they were seen then, like schizophrenia. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it genetic? Is it upbringing? It's almost impossible to answer that question because the two will interact necessarily. The only way you can actually strictly do it is by looking at identical twins who are reared separately. I mean, there's a methodology for looking at whether it's genetic or whether it's nurture. I'm not sure it really matters. It's interesting, isn't it, that there's an increasing incidence of this thing called ADHD, which would suggest that it's not strictly genetic. It has to be an interaction. Otherwise, it will be a product of what's gone before in your parents and be a fairly static occurrence, and that's not the case. I think whether or not it's an evolutionary theme is probably more interesting than whether it's genetic or nurture, which is something you raised then, I think, Anna.
Yeah, and that is interesting, isn't it? Is it evolutionary? Is that trigger loaded, but is it whether we pull that trigger or not due to what's happening in the world?
Yeah, and that's interesting because we know we're all living in a world that's moving at a rapid pace, changing dramatically. We've seen that. We saw that over the weekend, quite extraordinary things going on. Human beings are wonderfully adaptive, or have been historically. So the question is this another adaptation? Are our brains changing and changing the way we interact with the world because it's part of our human drive to survive? That's quite possible. Whether it's helpful to see it in those terms is another thing.
Thank you, John. So over to you, Andy. I know I said you shared some really, really open and honest discussions around your life in the previous episode, and as recently diagnosed with ADHD. What are your thoughts around that, and what's been your journey to where you are right now?
It's interesting because I have my own theories about evolution in terms of ADHD. So if you think back to when we were all kids, if you wanted to phone your girlfriend, you had to go up the road to the phone box if you didn't want to stand in your hallway and talk on a corded phone. There was no internet, there was no mobile phones pinging constantly, no social media or anything constantly getting our attention. And those were the days where Sunday afternoons you were bored because there was nothing to do. Whereas now we live in a world where we're almost fighting for time for all the things that we want to do, but we never get that downtime. So to me, logically, the adaptation or the evolution of the human mind is the thought that went through my head was, is this that our brains are responding to this never-ending stream of stimulus in the world around us, whereas 40 years ago, certainly when I was a kid, I was looking for stimulus because there just wasn't enough in the world around me. The jury's out on that one. I'm still not. There's so much I'm reading that goes for that argument and goes against it. In terms of kind of my journey to this point, John made an interesting comment when he was referencing an engineer he spoke to, who said he was generally seen as a pain in the ass by the rest of his organisation. That was me constantly. I mean, I'd encourage anybody to go back and listen to that episode. It's in the comments below this, but because there was a lot of insight in that one. But I was the guy that never really progressed anywhere in a career until I hit my mid-30s, when I started up on my own, because I got to a point where I got fed up with corporate life because I just didn't seem to fit in that box. Nothing was easy, nothing was pleasant. That's a bit negative, actually. There were pleasant experiences, but it just felt like life was a constant struggle to be heard and seen. I was always coming up with solutions to problems and trying to fix things and make things better for groups of people, whether they were colleagues or clients or whatever it was, but it always felt as if it was misunderstood or misconstrued.
We pick up that pain in the backside.
Yeah, go on.
Theme. And it is within an evolutionary context, because if it is the case that we're seeing a growing incidence of ADHD, it raises a question: why? Is there a purpose? I'm one of these people that struggles, maybe naively, to think that there isn't a purpose. It's just random. And maybe, Andy, you're right. It's to do with how human beings adapt to a changing world. The paradox in this for me is, and I'm sure people listening to this will get this, there's usually a tension between being creatures of habit. We always order the same stuff when we go to our local Indian restaurant, and a species that needs to change and adapt. There's a tension there. So when you get folk like you saying, I can see something different, it's actually quite threatening to folk who feel more comfortable in the creatures of habit space. So there is often, I think, this is your direct experience for people who go through life thinking, I can see something different here. And that's typically what we see, Anna, with ADHD and the GC index. Folk with ADHD do have this potential for creative, original, imaginative thinking. And while imagination is exciting and hopeful for many, for others, it will cause some resistance and pushback. And I think that's what you've lived with, Andy.
Absolutely. And there's a great example, which was I started working for a tour operator back in my mid-20s. And the first 7 weeks was a training course on the British Airways booking system. BABS it was called, but the system was Galileo that was used. And the job was selling commercial flights to tour operators and flight shops and places like that. And in that 7 weeks, there was 6 of us started the training. Half of us dropped out before the end of it, and then a number was sacked because they couldn't get their head around the system. And it drove me nuts because it wasn't user friendly. It was all coding and everything else. Now, a lot of people, and me included, I can't deal with coding. It does my head in. It's just write what you want to say, don't use whatever. So I made it through the training by the skin of my teeth, and then spent the first 3 months I was working in the role rewriting the training guide and the training for this system, because I could see a much easier way of teaching people how to use the system rather than the clunky training mechanism that was in place. I did it in my own time, off my own back. It never interfered with work. And I wrote this huge document. It was probably 2 inches thick, the training manual. Took it in, long story short, the full story's in the other podcast, but presented it, and they basically threw it in the bin. They weren't interested. It was different. It was a change. They didn't, and it really annoyed me, because it's like, can you not see that one, we could shorten the training and get your new people more productive quicker, making you money rather than costing you money? More importantly, it's the journey around onboarding new people into an organization and making their experience positive.
Well, maybe not. I mean, I think there's a responsibility for the individual in this, and your language is interesting, because again and again, when I have the conversation with game changers, as we call them, who can see a different world and who have ADHD, there is often this painful experience that they have, that they see things with just such clarity that no one else can see. And it is difficult, and especially when thinking is non-linear, and when thinking jumps around. How do you put that into words that engages other people? And I think, Anna, that's to your point. It is, there has to be a responsibility for the person with ADHD to recognize that is part of their difference. How do they bring that? How do they bring that so that they can be themselves in the workplace and make the contribution that they need to? Yes, it's all very well being different, but how do you bring that difference? And that is a struggle. I mean, I'm not minimizing that struggle, and it is hard, isn't it? But for me, that's part of it.
Hugely. And I think that to come back to you on that, and this is a conversation you and I mean, as you said in your intro, we've known each other a long time now. We have these open conversations. But so I was first introduced to the GC index by a friend. Now, I was highly allergic to any kind of profiling tool. I lost a job once because I refused to do Myers-Briggs because I thought it was a waste of time. And I was really skeptical when she said, "Oh, you need to try this." And when I did it, you had the pleasure of sitting with me in an Italian restaurant in London for 4 hours going through my profile back in the early days. It blew my head to pieces because it gave me a language and an understanding of myself that actually enabled me to take control of how I could communicate with the world and to be able to communicate in a way that people then understood. So I'd spent 30 odd years getting the messaging wrong, and go back to that example around the training manual. The way I sold it in was an absolute car crash. It made sense in my head, but what my manager probably saw was an over-animated, highly excited, energized individual come in his office telling him how pissed off he was that the training was as bad as it was and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Whereas now my approach would have been completely different because I know how now to communicate with people who are not game changers and not ADHD.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good story, because you obviously sort of grasp that sense of responsibility for saying, if I've got original ideas, I need to bring them to the world in a way that they can entertain rather than run away from. And
not threatening. Yeah.
What we're seeing in the science too, which is sort of consistent with that, is so the pictures of people who are clearly imaginative, clearly obsessive. This is your 2-inch document. But they also have very little energy for current reality. We call that the implementer, the person who's very grounded, very pragmatic. I always think of it. I love that Banksy painting, the little girl with the balloon. She lets go of the balloon. The balloon is you, Andy. The implementer is the little girl who's grounded in the real world. And it's, a lot of organizations are grounded in the real world. How do you engage and talk to them in a way that they can understand your ideas without the balloon floating off into space? I don't think it needs to be that difficult, actually. The story of the engineer I was telling you about was a lovely one, because so he was in GC Index terms, big game changer, really creative. He really struggled and was disruptive in meetings, because meetings have agendas, and then you sort of go through, let's do item one. And it used to drive him bonkers, and he'd get very disruptive. As soon as his colleagues realized that he couldn't cope with those linear activities, they changed the way they did their meetings to accommodate him. And you think, yeah, let's get into some practical interventions rather than seeing people as having some sort of condition that needs to be managed.
Interesting. There's lots of points here I'm hearing that I want us to pick up on a little bit more. So just to kind of summarize and pick out some key points as to where we're up to so far. First of all, I heard you, Andy, around you love creating solutions to problems. And with an ADHD brain, it's not always a linear pattern, is it? You can deviate from that linear pattern, which, as you said, Dr. John, most people are habitual, aren't they? They've got a way of doing it, a process of doing it. And that is a challenge, is being able to deviate from that process so that we can capture that innovation, but act upon it in a more timely manner. So going back to your engineer who was very game changer orientated, they had to change the meetings to engage him to be able to act upon those things in a quicker time. Two quick examples: in pharma, presented about 12 years ago the idea of engaging with healthcare professionals online, and it was poo-pooed because they wouldn't be able to do it. Fast forward today, it's the norm. Also presented about, again, 12, 13 years ago, the use of using 3D modeling so that they could understand, process of medical conditions a little bit more. That was poo-pooed. And today it's considered really innovative. But key learnings was that, as you said, Andy, as well, there'd been that miscommunication. And this is where we need to be able to engage all different people. And I think, Dr. John, this is what you're doing in your work, with this research, and both you and Andy are doing with the Game Changer Index. So if you could just give us a really clear, concise overview of what the Game Changer Index is, I think this will give us some really good foundations moving forward as to how we can put those solutions, collaborate in a collaborative environment in the workplace.
Okay, I'll have a go. So what the GC Index does is it looks at individual differences in terms of how people channel their energy to make an impact in their world. And broadly speaking, we have people who have energy for ideas, possibilities, and we have people who have energy for getting things done, practical outcomes, tangible outcomes. We have people who have energy for building relationships. And in between those three, we have lots of different combinations. And that's what you get from GC Index profile. So I would sit down with Andy and say, gosh, you got a lot of energy here for imagining possibilities and obsessing about them. You don't have the same sort of energy when it comes to filling in your expenses form or whatever it might be, those practical routine tasks. That's what the GC Index does. It assumes that we all go through life wanting to have an impact. And I think that's a reasonable assumption. We learn, we grow, we develop, we adapt, we channel our energy, and we do it in the context of our relationships too. And so what we're glimpsing really with the GC Index and ADHD is just the fact that, people's minds might be wired differently for whatever reason. There might be all sorts of interesting biochemical things going on, but they can make a contribution to their world that can be extraordinary if we recognize that difference. Don't see it as a disability, but see it as a positive thing to bring and create the sort of environment that's conducive to that. Is that enough on the science, Anna?
That's good. Yeah, that's good. I'm just going to ask Andy another question as well now as a bit of follow-up to that. So on reflection, Andy, now knowing a little bit more about how different people are energized and how maybe you may go a little bit non-linear at certain times, how could you have brought people in quicker in terms of your communication with some of those innovative solutions that you've come up with? How, when you reflect on this now that you know about different energies and the way that different brains work, what would you have done differently?
So now I have to rein in the enthusiasm for this because I've got a million stories to tell you on this one.
Pick out your best.
So a couple of years back, I had the pleasure of working with an organisation, national organisation that was going through a restructure. And they pulled me in to do their rebrand and marketing strategy and comm strategy and various other bits and pieces. And I walked into the office on day one. And if this had been 15 years ago, I'd have walked into the office on day one, bouncing around the office like Tigger. I was quite often called Tigger at work. On this occasion, because it was an incredibly important contract for me. It was the cutting edge contract of my career. I went in And I spent a week sitting, listening and watching and engaging with the team, that my direct reports, on a very passive level, not disconnected from them, but just on a real low energy, getting to know you kind of way. And it worked because the team didn't react to me the way that teams had done in the past. There wasn't an allergic, violent reaction to who the hell is this that's just walked in or bounced in through the office door and started projecting ideas all over the place and highlighting that this needs to change and that needs to change, and all this kind of chaos that normally comes in this big storm cloud with me that walks in the door. And it was magic because I worked with them for 9 months. It was a 9-month contract. And we did some incredible stuff. Now, to pick up on one of John's points, 3/4 of that team were people who like the status quo. So they are my opposites. Change scares them, really scares them. And I was so mindful of that I was able to identify fairly quickly who those people were. And actually, for validation, I then took the GC index in and profiled all of the team. So I then knew factually who was who. And I was able to adapt my behavior around those individuals, that when there was a change that I was introducing, or a new process or a new policy or whatever it was, I did it in a way that empowered them to see it as being part of their normal. And that, yes, it was change, but actually it was an enhancement to their status quo.
Yeah.
Now, again, if I'd gone back 15 years, I'd have gone in, profiled a lot of them and gone, right, you lot, this is what we're going to do. It's really exciting because it gives us this opportunity and this opportunity, and it will change this and it will benefit that, and all the other reasons why we do change. But they instantly would have locked down. I would have ended up with a team completely demoralized and probably fearful of me as a leader. And there would have been no psychological safety, no trust, nothing. So it's about, and it goes back to my point I said to John earlier when he did my review 10 years ago. It goes back to having a language, but actually more importantly, understanding your audience. Now, the GC index gives me an insight into people I'm talking to that you can't get through any other mechanism. And I use it now. So if ever I'm talking to anybody, potentially a new client or somebody else within a circle or a network, one of the first questions I ask them is, have you ever taken the GC index? If they say yes, that's music to my ears, because then I ask them what their profile is. Now, if they're game changer or strategist, I fizz with those individuals because I don't have to filter as much, or I don't have to adapt as much. If they're implementers or polishers, I'm still myself, so I'm not masking or filtering. It's about the wording and the language and the level of energy that I use to communicate with those individuals. One very quick example, I profiled somebody recently who posted something on LinkedIn that really inspired me. And I contacted him and said, look, slightly out of context, but just do the GC index profile because it might work with what you're doing. And he came up as an implementer, completely the opposite to me. And when I did his review, I had this thing in the back of my head. And before the call connected, the Zoom call connected, I said to myself, Andy, he's a 10 implementer. Keep your energy down. Don't throw the million ideas at him about what he could do with the tool for his business. Just show him the tool and he'll figure that out for himself. So it's this language of diversity and inclusion that enables this big, chaotic, highly energized, like I said, 500 ideas a second, 500 mile an hour person to exist and excel in a world where they only want 1 or 2 ideas a week and they don't want high energy because they've got a job to be getting on with, and it's the status quo. It's about understanding yourself and the impact you have on others, not by looking at others and going, well, you don't work for me, so I'm not going to talk to you, or your energy doesn't work for me, so I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to go somewhere else. It's so empowering. So
It's a
empowering.
great story. It's a lovely story, Andy. I mean, I knew that story from old, but it does illustrate that, sometimes there's a cost for game changers with ADHD to manage that energy so that it doesn't overwhelm other folk. And that's probably another conversation to think about the cost of that. And it reminded me of a couple of things, really. The number of game changers, again, with ADHD, not all game changers report ADHD, but who will say, you know, I've got a reputation for seeing around corners. Brains are wired differently, and that's an extraordinary contribution to make if you can make it well. I went to the movies over the weekend and saw, if you haven't seen it, go and see it, The Complete Unknown, the story of Bob Dylan's early career. Now, all the characteristics of a game changer with ADHD, up in the middle of the night writing songs, couldn't stop. Just a flood of ideas, creativity, obsessive creativity. Yeah.
And that's like a real example, isn't it, of someone who's been able to really put those ideas, you know, into something magical. And this is what it's about, isn't it? It's about being able to.
And they can't not, these folk. They have to. There's such a pressure that I think that's my point that I recognise in folk like Andy. There's such a pressure to want to express, want to be creative, want to give the world their ideas. It's not easy, Andy, is it? That
no, and actually, you've just triggered this, probably too strong a word, but you've just triggered a thought in my head, because this is something I've always been quite defensive or insecure about. One of the labels I always got labeled with was arrogant. And that was born from this desire, this passion to push my idea. Now, I understand now why the world will see that as arrogance. Oh, it's always Andy's ideas. Why has he always got to voice his ideas? Why can't he just shut up and listen to somebody else's ideas? It's not that the energy is not born of self. It's about the bigger picture, the greater good. Now, I'm not saying I'm a martyr either. Absolutely not. What I'm saying is that when I see an idea, which in my head, it's so blatantly obvious that this will bring huge benefits for the collective good, I will jump over people to get the idea heard. But that's not a self-centered thing. It's a scrabble for the greater good. And this is where it's so often misconstrued. I think the other point I want to make with this as well is, for those of you that haven't seen it or don't know it, go onto YouTube and look up Steve Jobs, the Crazy One
Oh
speech.
yeah, I love that one.
That whoa, yeah, that's hit me. I can't watch that now. It affects me so deeply emotionally, because that speech, and I've got it on it's framed on the landing over my stairs. I see it every time I come downstairs in the morning. He perfectly describes the game changer, or the person with autism, or the person with ADHD, or any neurodivergence. And it's about the people, what he says, the people, it's like putting square pegs in round holes, and the people that are crazy enough to think they can change the world are quite often the people that do. The only bit that I don't like about that is the use of the word crazy. But I've taken it as a term of affection from him to those of us out there who are crazy enough to think we can change the world. But the way I like to adapt it is to say that the craziness is actually the passion to deliver the message. That's why we go crazy, because we need this idea out there. So it's being heard and being seen, which, as a side note, is ironic, because the reason my business and my wife's business are called Be Seen and Be Heard Media. They're two separate companies, but that's where those names came from. It was this desire to be heard and this desire to be seen. So that's how fundamental this is at the core of our beings. So my wife's a game changer as well. It's being seen and being heard, but it's understanding that to achieve that, we have to adapt the way we deliver that message. So I don't jump over people or on people anymore to deliver the message. I'm far more careful and considered about how I get that idea spoken.
And just for Emma's benefit, just going back to the science for the moment, our research shows that around 95% of people who report a formal diagnosis of ADHD are game changers but not all game changers have ADHD. I don't like the word have. Makes it sound like it's
Yeah.
a rash of some sort, doesn't it? But yeah, just to be clear about that. But
Yeah.
if we're looking at commonalities, folk with ADHD would typically see themselves as imaginative and obsessive in different worlds.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe we could dig a little bit deeper into this data now you started to talk about it, but I'm just going to take one step back in terms of Andy's comments that are around, two really key words about being seen and being heard. We all want to be seen and we all want to be heard. And when you gave us that wonderful example around working with this big client, Andy, and you went in there differently, sitting, I've got written this down, sitting, listening, watching, and I wondered how uncomfortable that actually felt for you. But what you were doing is making sure that everybody was seen and heard, because as humans, we all want to be seen and heard. And hopefully this can bring you on to your data, John, as to how you can empower us all to be seen and heard.
I think that's a brilliant summary, actually. That's a brilliant summary, because the risk is that if people feel or they're seen as different, it's alienating, isn't it? That's your point, and you've had that experience, Andy, of feeling alienated.
Yeah, it's and actually I'm going to pick up on something Anna just said. It wasn't uncomfortable at all, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but one of the things with ADHD is that if you create an idea in your own head, so I'm thinking domestically now, you'll execute it. But if somebody else comes to you and asks you to do it, there's a resistance. This is an element within ADHD. Because in that contract with that client, I sat for weeks, and this was mainly driven by imposter syndrome, but I was sat thinking about, right, you need to be very careful how you go in and deal with this. Because it was my idea to go in and sit and just be. It wasn't uncomfortable at all, because the game changer in me, so the creativity part of my head saw it. So that action was driven by that joining dots. And what it was telling me was, look, if you go in and keep your mouth shut for a week and do what you need to do in terms of facilitating psychological safety and trust, the end result is going to be so good that it took the pain away. There was no pain, just sitting and listening. Now, day to day, there were little itches in me that were going, oh, God, you could say this, or you could throw that idea in. But actually, the bigger picture again was just sit and be and listen and observe and talk and be gentle about the situation. Yeah, 100%. And to your point, John, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's hugely challenging when you're stumbling for ways of being, or rather when you're constantly misunderstood and misinterpreted, and the damage that does to your self-esteem and self-confidence, as the previous podcast covered, Anna, is phenomenal. It breaks people.
It's interesting, just going back to the nature nurture theme, and this is probably in the next research project, Anna, but the number of game changers without ADHD who report growing up often feeling like they're on the outside looking in. It could be an expat living in a different country or growing up in another country. It could be a third child, a fourth child on the outside looking in. That experience, as we understand it, will often lead to a different way of seeing the world that's not a traditional way of seeing the world. And then what transpires is just what you've described, is how do you bring that to the world so you can be seen and heard. And that's the inspiring bit about your story, Andy. It's possible, I think, is what we're saying, isn't it? It takes some thought, but it's possible.
Yeah. And it's being able to understand enough about yourself to be able to do it. Because if I didn't have the GC index profile 8 years ago, I would probably still be in the same position I was in 9 years ago, being misunderstood, being booted from one job or leaving or whatever it was, because I wouldn't have had the ability to understand the people around me, to adapt the way that I communicate. And no, look, yes, there are millions of other ways you can learn through coaching around behaviors and everything else, but they don't really come close to this GC index thing that gave me that language and the insight of how my brain actually works. Put the ADHD to one side, because there's still this big game changer energy which correlates with ADHD, sure. But I said to you at the time, it knocked me sideways for 3 months. It literally knocked me off my feet for 3 months of, why didn't I have this 20 years ago when I broke into the working world and started my career? And I went through the waves of depression and everything else because I felt like I'd wasted 20 years and all this kind of stuff. So it's profound, but it's having that understanding. That's the key thing with all of this, is if you understand yourself, whether you're a game changer or you've got ADHD or any other neurodiversity or all of it, if you've got that understanding, you stand a far better chance of being understood and making yourself understood than you've ever had before. It's that self-awareness piece.
Absolutely.
It literally saved me. Literally saved me.
Really, really powerful, isn't it? How you can empower yourself so much to understand who you are, but then that gives you the confidence to be able to voice it to the rest of the world. And what we really need to do now is ensure that the rest of the world are embracing individuality, uniqueness, and our whole self, so that workplaces, can thrive, because without missing that uniqueness of everyone and what they bring to the table, they are going to be stifled in the growth. Tell us, John, what you found in your study. Come on, let our listeners hear now about it.
I think we've covered off and consistent with that lovely summary, Anna. It was an attempt to say, okay, if folk with ADHD, dyslexia are different, if their brains are wired differently, how can we understand them so that they can make that contribution? They can be different, but bring a valued contribution. And that's what our research shows. It does show, just as you were saying earlier, Andy, these probably are folk who will bring you original thinking. They'll bring you creativity, help them to do that. They can help themselves to do that. That's what Andy's story is all about. And a big part of that too is try and, where you can, stay grounded in the present, because that's often where the rest of the world might be at any particular point in time. And they're not ready to join you in the stratosphere, that they want to stick with what they know. It's that creatures of habit versus, the possibilities of something different. So that's all our research is saying. See those differences through a lens of how people like to channel their energy, and you will see something different in them that you can value, and more than value, need in an organizational setting. Organizations are constantly in need of reinventing themselves. They need ideas to do that.
Absolutely. So in terms of some of the topics, that are very important this year and moving forward in the place of work, obviously, burnout is still a really high issue, and costly as well to organisations. How do you think those people with neurodiversity, and in particular ADHD, can be more susceptible to burnout than maybe others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a broad principle here to hold on to with the GC index in terms of what we're seeing is that if the way you like to channel your energy is aligned to the demands of your world, big tick, happy. If I like to channel my energy into details and precision and doing things and getting things right, and I'm an auditor, big tick, I'm going to be happy. Where there's a mismatch between where your energy is and what the world is asking of you, and it was true of Bob Dylan at various times. He wanted the freedom to write. His agents wanted him to do something else. When there's a mismatch, it's always a recipe for burnout. If the world is asking something of you that you don't have the energy for, over time, you'll become increasingly depleted. And that's the definition of burnout. You've got no energy left.
Yeah. So what you're in essence saying is that if you want to reduce your chances of burnout, you need to be in a role that's fueling your passion and fueling your energy, and you feel like you're making a difference on the world, so that you're not pedaling against the tide. So for instance, if you put Andy in a role doing expenses, his risk of burnout could be slightly higher than in a role where you're saying, Andy, give me your wonderful ideas. Tell us how we're going to take our organisation to the next level in future.
Yeah. No, that's it. That's perfect. And saying, Andy, it doesn't matter if your first 10 ideas are rubbish, because we know your 11th idea is likely to be a good one.
Absolutely. So this again could be really useful in terms of attracting talent, couldn't it? To make sure you get the right people,
Oh yeah,
the right roles as well. And if you're doing that, then I guess you're minimising the risk of burnout as well.
yeah. And if you've got a 14-year-old, and you think that they have a career in law and they're a game changer, you might want to have a conversation about that and ask the question: is that profession going to satisfy your need for creative expression?
I'm giggling to myself actually right now, because I've got a 15-year-old who I only wrote an email yesterday to the director of an interior design company saying that she's got dyslexic thinking, so is able to spot creative things that other people can't, which was really lovely to be able to write that in terms of, you know, how it would be an enabler in that role. So just quick example around
Lovely. What a great
that diversity.
I'm going to throw one more in there. If you, if anybody's interested on a real example of where it can go massively wrong, go back and listen to the other podcast, because I spent 8 years working in law enforcement, which is very much status quo, governance, strict rules, and everything else. And yes, I managed to find pockets where I could be creative, but quite often that got me in trouble. But that's on the other podcast, so definitely go back and listen to it. But you'll see some good examples there as well.
So this might be a great opportunity actually to include something we weren't actually going to delve into, but we also have a young person's index, don't we, as well, which I again have found really fascinating, with the same daughter who has done the young person's version of the Game Changer Index, and ironically it comes up, you know, mirror image of my own. But this has really helped me in terms of parenting to understand her better, and this can be a big challenge when we think about, is it genetic? You know, people with those ADHD minds are likely to be living with other people with ADHD minds, which can create for a very, very busy, fast-paced life. So tell us a bit more about that young person's index and how this could be an enabler and empowering young people to know who they are from a very young age.
It's a similar theme really, because what we see with young people is you see in terms of GC index profiles, we see the same diversity. Kids are different; they're as different as adults are, and so when they fill in the profile and they see their profile, it allows you to have the conversation that says, okay, you've got lots of energy for implementing, getting stuff done. What would that mean in terms of you choosing a career? You've got this, I'll tell a very quick story. I don't know whether this answers your question, or my daughter, my youngest daughter, I profile all my kids. Anyway, during her first job, she redid the GC index actually, and came out with this strong strategist energy. Strategist energy is like about making sense of the world, looking for patterns, looking for trends, thinking about the future, big picture thinking, and was quite different from the first time she did it when it was a low score. And we both realised, to cut a long story short here, that she'd gone through her school career being told off for asking why questions. She was being, I used to dread parents' evenings. Oh, she's rude. She always asks why. And maybe she didn't ask why in a nice way, particularly, who knows? But then she has this boss who says, yeah, challenge, ask why. A woman who was comfortable enough in her own skin to take that, and that liberated my daughter's energy. That's what you're looking for with young folk, is the conversation that says, what's going to allow you to be your whole self at work and to express your energy, whatever it is.
Fascinating. And capturing that understanding early on can stop people being knocked down for a question that why, which can not the confidence as well, which can impact on them long term. So yeah, really great. As with everything I advocate is early intervention. Early intervention is the key. And I think that's a great example. So we've explored lots of different avenues today. I think it's been really fascinating to get the science, the data, and some really great examples and application from Andy. What I would just love is your final comments that you'd like to leave our listeners with today, please. Dr. John.
Yes. Let's think of the ways that we can both recognise but celebrate difference. Bit of a cliche, but when we're talking about ADHD and when we're talking about GC index profiles and the ways in which people like to express their energy, we are different, we are diverse. This is a way of not just being inclusive, but being involving. How do we involve people? It's all very well to ask them to join the party or sit around the table. This is a way of saying, I know what you can bring. It's partly your responsibility too, but make your contribution.
Amazing. Do not just be inclusive, be involving, which I guess makes the people feel seen and heard. Thank you, Dr. John. Andy, any of your closing thoughts?
I think it's the other half of that, which is that it's really important for people to realise that it's not just on the employer to make all the changes and adaptations and everything to facilitate people like me. It's actually on the individual themselves. You've got to understand yourself. How can you expect somebody to engage with you if you don't know how to engage with others? So for me, it's that self-awareness piece, understanding what it really means to be who you are by exploring who you are and finding out what that looks like. And then learning or understanding that not everybody's the same. I spent 25 years, 30 years thinking everyone was the same as me. And it's just that there was something wrong with me. That's not the case. So I think awareness is probably the best word. Be self-aware, be aware of others and understand what you need to do to make sure that you are heard and seen in a way that's accepted by all.
Thank you. Beautifully said. So thank you again for your time. It's been really valuable. I'm going to put some links in the show notes as to where people can find you. I know you both do lots of amazing things on LinkedIn, lots and lots of interesting things around ADHD, around your energy for impact. And yes, thank you once again. So before you stop listening, I want you to pause. What did you take away from the podcast today? What small steps will you start? And what did you hear that you know could help someone else to make small steps to lead their health, wellbeing, productivity and performance? Please do share this episode and please subscribe to the podcast. And remember that Leap Health are here to provide workplace, health, wellbeing and performance workshops, one-to-one coaching and bespoke corporate solutions to help the world make small steps to leap health, wellbeing, productivity and performance. Please do get in touch. It's Anna at leaphealth.co.uk. Have a great day.